account of the God which was covered therein and inseparable therefrom. I separate the natures, but I unite the worship. Consider what this must mean. He who was formed in the womb of Mary, was not himself God, but God assumed him asamzit, i.e. clothed himself with humanity, and on account of him who assumed, he who was assumed is also called God. Schaff gives the translation of John 2:21 from the New Revised Standard Version repeated here with context. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews therefore said, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou raise it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. John 2:19-21 New Revised Standard Version. Where did the concept come from? 83 Nestorius's understanding seems to be somewhat akin to what Bart Ehrman terms separationist ibid, pp. 170-171. He describes this as the human Jesus being held to be distinct from the divine Christ who temporarily dwelt in him and enabled him to work miracles, abandoning him to face the crucifixion alone. More than one group held this understanding, or something somewhat similar, including the Gnostics. Just this brief review makes it clear that the concept of Jesus as God was not universally accepted in the early church, and there was a variety of interpretations in circulation then. Certainly, if the Council of Nicaea of 325 codified the doctrine of the Incarnation and declared other understandings heretical, there were other understandings with enough followers to precipitate such an action. The myth of God incarnate. Theological examination. In addition to the historical aspects of the divinity of Jesus, there are the theological implications. The whole doctrine of Jesus's divinity has been thoroughly examined in The Myth of God Incarnate ed. J. Hick, Westminster Press, 1977. This important book is not readily available now. Therefore, I have quoted a bit more extensively from it. One look at the list of Christian scholars who contributed to this collection shows that it is not a radical fringe among modern theologians who reject this doctrine of incarnation. This book was authored by a number of careful and highly qualified theologians, listed here with the credentials they held when the book was first published. Don Cuppert, University Lecturer in Divinity and Dean of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, UK. Michael Goulder, Staff Tutor in Theology in the Department of Extramural Studies at Birmingham University. 84. Development of the Christian Doctrine. John Hick, H.G. Wood Professor of Theology at Birmingham University. Leslie Holden, Principal of Ripon College, Chudston. Dennis Nineham, Warden of Keble College, Oxford. Maurice Wiles, Regius Professor of Divinity and Canon of Christ Church of England, S. Doctrine Commission. Francis Young, Lecturer in New Testament Studies at Birmingham University. From the Preface of The Myth of God Incarnate Ibid, p. Ix. The writers of this book are convinced that another major theological development is called for in this last part of the 20th century. The need arises from growing knowledge of Christian origins, and involves a recognition that Jesus was as he is presented in Acts 2.21, a man approved by God, for a special role within the divine purpose, and that the later conception of him as God incarnate, the second person of the Holy Trinity living a human life, is a mythological or poetic way of expressing his significance for us. This recognition is called for in the interests of truth. For Christianity can only remain honestly believable by being continuously open to the truth. In the same book Ibid, p. 4, Maurice Wiles writes, negative generalizations are notoriously dangerous claims to make. Nevertheless, it seems to me that throughout the long history of attempts to present a reasoned account of Christ as both fully human and fully divine, the Church has never succeeded in offering a consistent or convincing picture. Mr. Wiles, who was at the time canon of Christ Church, goes on to urge that Christianity without incarnation should be regarded as a positive and constructive idea, rather than negative and destructive. He points out that the worship of Christ, traditional throughout the whole of Christian history, is idolatrous in character. Where did the concept come from? 85 Some 3 centuries after Jesus' death, culminating with the Council of Nicaea of 325 AD, a politically motivated church solidified the doctrine of God incarnate. In The Myth of God Incarnate Ibid, p. 17, Francis Young makes an interesting and critical observation, pointing out that the focus of the Gospels is quite different from that of Jesus' own teachings. The epistles of Paul, and indeed the speeches of Acts, reveal that the early Christian gospel was about Jesus Christ. This makes it the more likely that the Gospels correctly report that the message of Jesus was different. It was about the kingdom of God. There are difficulties in tracing explicit messianic claims back to Jesus himself. Apart from John, where interpretative material is clearly placed upon the lips of Jesus, the Gospels invariably portray not Jesus but others as using phrases like the Holy One of God, or Son of David, or Son of God. Furthermore, Mark's Gospel conveys the impression that Jesus attempted to keep his identity as Messiah a secret divulged only to his inner circle. This messianic secret motif in Mark remains an unsolved problem, especially since it appears sometimes to be introduced rather artificially. Yet it adds to the impression that Jesus may well have preferred to remain enigmatic, in the interests of directing his hearers away from false enthusiasm for himself, to the consequences of the coming of God's kingdom for their lives here and now. Young goes farther, arguing that Paul never claimed Jesus was God. Ibid, pp.